What happens when a quiet night alone takes a shocking turn? You won't believe how one simple moment changed everything between a mother and her son. Stay till the end to uncover the truth. The house in Cleveland, Ohio, was quiet. Autumn had settled over everything, lending a strange weight to the walls around me. My mind wandered between the pressures of school and the allure of finally having a place to myself for the weekend. My dad, Richard, had been on a business trip for weeks, and my mom, Sarah, who had just returned from visiting her sister, mentioned she'd be heading out again soon to meet with an old friend. I remember the subtle exhaustion in her eyes as she explained her plans. At 46 years old, she looked a little older than her years, as if the weight of life was catching up to her. She seemed tired, almost as though she was trying to escape something, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. I nodded absent-mindedly, excited at the idea of having the house to myself. The door clicked shut, and the moment she was gone, I headed straight to my room, feeling a strange, liberating solitude settle around me. I dropped my backpack onto the floor, closed the blinds, and felt a rare sense of peace wash over me. Time passed by unnoticed as I let myself relax, diving into my own thoughts and distractions for the first time in what felt like ages. The echo of a car door slamming shut jolted me from my reverie. I froze. My mom shouldn't be back yet, she had just left. The sound of her keys jangling against the door was like a thunderclap, louder than it had any right to be. The door swung open, and I heard her familiar voice call out. "Hello." Her voice carried through the hall with its usual calm tone, but there was something different this time, something that sent a chill through my gut. Panic surged, too quick to suppress. I moved hastily, trying to hide the overwhelming evidence of my solitude, but it was too late. The doorknob twisted, and in a heartbeat, she was standing in the doorway. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, and everything inside me froze, cold. "Sorry," I mumbled, but the words felt weak and hollow. Her eyes held confusion, sharp and cutting. She looked at me, really looked at me, as if she was seeing something she couldn't fully comprehend. A tense silence filled the room as she took a breath, blinking as though trying to process what she had walked in on. I wanted to explain, to say something, but no words came. My throat felt dry, and I just stood there, waiting for her to speak, to say anything that would break the icy quiet between us. Her expression softened, but only slightly. It wasn't anger I saw in her eyes, there was something much more complicated. After what felt like an eternity, she sighed softly, her face shifting into a look I couldn't quite read. Without another word, she blinked a few times, then turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I heard her footsteps fading down the hallway. I let out a long breath, my mind swirling with embarrassment, confusion, and a sense of unease I couldn't quite place. The tension in the house was like thick fog, clinging to everything. Each step I took felt heavy, and I found myself avoiding her, not out of fear, but from sheer discomfort. My mind kept replaying the moment she walked into my room, her startled face, the silent tension that followed. No matter how much I wanted to forget it, the memory lingered, casting a shadow over everything. It was late one evening, just as I was trying to focus on my textbook, when there came a soft knock on my door. I froze for a moment, unsure if I wanted to face her, but then her voice came, gentle and hesitant. "Are you busy?" she asked quietly. I took a deep breath, closing my book and steadying myself. "No, just reading," I replied, keeping my tone casual. The door creaked open, and she peeked in with a slight smile on her face. There was a softness in her expression that made her seem more like the mom I remembered from my younger days. "I was just thinking," she began, "do you remember how we used to stay up watching movies together? Those all-night marathons?" Her voice held a note of nostalgia, and for a brief moment, I saw the version of her that was always full of warmth and light, the kind of mom who always made time for me, even when life got hectic. "Yeah, of course I remember," I said, my own voice softening as warmth crept in despite myself. "Would you want to do that again?" she asked, almost shyly. We could pick one of those old movies you loved. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to avoid the awkwardness still lingering between us. But another part of me, the part that missed those moments of closeness, urged me to say yes. I forced a smile and nodded. Sure, why not? A few minutes later, we were both settled in the living room. A stack of old DVDs lay on the coffee table, and the soft glow of a lamp made the room feel cozier than it had in weeks. She curled up on the couch, looking more relaxed than I had seen her in a long time, as if the weight of the last few days had lifted. I felt myself relaxing too, letting my guard down just a little. We picked a movie we'd both seen 100 times, the kind of film you can quote word for word. As it started, she chuckled at a familiar line, and I found myself laughing too. Slowly, the tension between us began to dissolve, replaced by an ease that felt natural. I hadn't realized how much I missed this, the comfort of simply being in each other's company. About halfway through the movie, she reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm glad we're doing this," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine for a brief second before darting away. I felt a wave of warmth spread through me, something calming and reassuring. "Me too," I replied, almost in a whisper, feeling the strange connection between us. I wasn't sure what was happening, but in that moment, everything felt right. As the credits rolled, I realized she was still holding my hand. She looked over at me, her expression soft, almost vulnerable. The silence between us felt charged with unspoken words. And then, so naturally it surprised me, she leaned in and brushed her lips gently against my cheek. I froze, caught off guard. It was brief, almost innocent, but there was a tenderness in the gesture that felt deeper than I had expected. She quickly turned away, and for a moment, we sat in silence, too stunned to speak. She cleared her throat, shifted on the couch, and stood up. "Good night," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She left the room, and I was left sitting there, my mind racing as I replayed the moment over and over. As I sat in the dim light, surrounded by the soft hum of the DVD player, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't fully define. The next few days were filled with an unspoken awareness between us. We didn't mention that night in the living room, the movie, the laughter, the gentle touch. But I felt it lingering in every glance, every fleeting moment we spent in the same space. I wanted to bring it up, to clear the air, but every time the words disappeared before I could say anything. One afternoon, she knocked gently on my door again. This time, she seemed different, calmer, as if she had come to a decision. "I was thinking," she began, stepping inside, "what if we took a little trip? Just the two of us, to clear our heads." "A trip?" I asked, surprised. She smiled faintly, as if she had anticipated my reaction. "Yeah. Somewhere peaceful. We could just sit by the lake, get away from everything for a bit." There was something about the idea that resonated with me. Maybe we both needed some space, a change of scenery, to find some clarity. "Sure," I said, nodding. "That sounds nice." The drive to the lake was longer than I expected, but the silence between us was comfortable. Sarah had put on a playlist of soft, nostalgic tunes that filled the car with a sense of calm. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur as we passed them, letting the quiet hum of the engine soothe my thoughts. It felt like we were both searching for something in this journey, a way to make sense of everything that had shifted between us. When we finally reached the lake, I was struck by its beauty. The water was still and serene, reflecting the sky perfectly. It felt like we had stepped into another world, untouched by the complexity of our lives. We found a spot near the shore, spread out a blanket, and sat down with the peaceful lake stretching out in front of us. Sarah sighed, leaning back and closing her eyes as the cool breeze gently played with her hair. "I missed this," she murmured, almost to herself. "I missed just being." I watched her for a moment, feeling a twinge of something I couldn't quite define. "Yeah," I replied softly, looking out over the water. Sometimes it feels like everything is moving so fast, and we're just stuck. She opened her eyes, glancing at me with an expression that was both familiar and new. It's hard to find moments like this anymore, she said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Life just takes over, doesn't it? I nodded, the weight of her words settling in my chest. We sat in silence for a while, simply watching the lake, letting the quiet fill the space between us. It felt like a release, a moment to breathe in sync with the world around us. Then, unexpectedly, she reached over and placed her hand on mine, her touch warm and comforting. I looked down at our intertwined hands, feeling a jolt of warmth spread up my arm. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight that neither of us seemed ready to acknowledge. "This is nice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I could feel her gaze on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. I knew that if I did, I would see something I wasn't prepared to face. The silence between us stretched on, heavy yet comforting in its own way. Then, without a word, she leaned her head on my shoulder, letting out a soft sigh. It was a small act, something we had done countless times before, but this time, it felt different. There was a quiet intimacy in the gesture, something deeper than either of us could express. After a long while, she lifted her head and looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "I'm glad we did this," she said softly, her voice laced with a tenderness that caught me off guard. "Me too," I replied, barely able to keep my voice steady. For a moment, we just sat there, locked in each other's gaze. I felt something shift between us, an invisible thread pulling us closer. Then, almost instinctively, I leaned in, my lips brushing against hers in a soft, tentative kiss. It was brief, barely a whisper of a kiss, but the impact was undeniable. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she stayed close, her expression filled with a quiet understanding. Neither of us said a word, we didn't need to. She simply leaned her head back on my shoulder, and we continued to sit in silence, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The tension between us grew heavier with each passing day. We didn't speak about that afternoon by the lake, but I could feel it in every glance, in every accidental brush of our hands. It was a strange, unspoken connection, something neither of us knew how to address. Part of me wanted to bring it up, to face whatever it was, but another part of me was afraid of what it would mean if we acknowledged it. It was late one night, long after I had settled into my room, trying to focus on my coursework, when I heard a soft knock on my door. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, gentle but insistent. "Are you still awake?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper from the other side of the door. I hesitated, my pulse quickening as the pages of my textbook blurred before me. "Yeah, I'm up." "You can come in," I replied, closing my book and sitting up. She stepped into the room, wearing a soft, oversized sweater, her hair slightly messy, as if she hadn't been able to sleep either. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, hesitant, unsure, but there was something deeper in her gaze that mirrored the confusion swirling inside me. "I know it's late," she said softly, glancing away as if second-guessing herself. "But, do you think you could join me in the living room?" I was feeling a little restless. I nodded, feeling the same pull I had felt by the lake. "Of course. Let's go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We walked quietly down the hallway, and the stillness of the house felt different, almost charged. The living room was dimly lit, with a soft glow from the lamp beside the couch. She had already prepared a cozy spot with blankets and a bottle of wine resting on the coffee table, its dark red hue catching the low light. She poured 2 glasses, her movements slow and deliberate, almost as if this moment required a kind of ritual. We sat in silence for a while, sipping the wine, letting the warmth of it spread through us. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted quietly, breaking the silence. "I've been thinking about everything." I nodded, feeling the tension build inside me. "Yeah, me too," I replied, surprised at the honesty in my own voice. "It's like A lot has changed, even though we're both pretending it hasn't. She stared down at her glass, her fingers tracing its rim as if she was searching for the right words. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And I don't know how to fix it. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and raw. There was a vulnerability in her voice that I hadn't heard before. I wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, but I didn't know how. Instead, I just sat there, watching her as she took a shaky breath. It's like I'm losing you, she continued, her voice thick with emotion. And I don't know how to stop it. Everything feels different, and I don't know if it's supposed to. Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. I had never heard her speak so openly, so honestly about what she was feeling. I set my glass down and reached out, covering her hand with mine. You're not losing me, I said softly, feeling the weight of every word. I'm still here. We're both still here. She looked up at me, her expression filled with fragile hope, mixed with fear. For a long moment, we just held each other's gaze, the unspoken tension between us building, tightening like a thread pulled too taut. Neither of us moved, but the space between us felt smaller, more intimate, as if we were both waiting for something to happen. I don't know who moved first, but suddenly, we were close, our faces inches apart. I could feel her breath warm against my skin, and for a brief second, I saw the uncertainty flicker in her eyes. Then she closed them, leaning forward, her lips brushing softly against mine in a hesitant, almost questioning kiss. This kiss was different, gentler, slower, as if she was testing the waters, unsure of how far to go. But there was warmth in it, a tenderness that felt both familiar and foreign. We pulled back after a moment, the silence between us heavy with unsaid words. She looked at me, her eyes wide and searching, but I had no answers to offer her. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know. I don't know why I did that. I shook my head, struggling to find my own voice. You don't have to apologize, I said, barely managing to keep my tone steady. I didn't want to stop you. Her eyes filled with tears, and she closed them, a single tear slipping down her cheek. This is all so confusing, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I don't know what's right anymore. We sat there, the weight of her words pressing down on both of us. I wanted to reach out, to hold her, to comfort her, but I didn't know how. Instead, I just watched as she leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close, and for a long while, we just sat there in silence, letting the unspoken emotions hang between us. As the night wore on, the events of the evening began to settle heavily in my mind. She eventually drifted off to sleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady, her hand still resting in mine. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. What were we doing? What did any of this mean for us? I couldn't ignore the feelings that had surfaced, the emotions I had kept buried. But the fear of crossing a line we couldn't return from kept me frozen in place. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I gently slipped away, covering her with the blanket and retreating quietly to my room. I needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew things would never be the same. That night had changed something between us, left a mark that couldn't be erased. And as much as I wanted to hold on to the closeness we had found, I knew we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could either bring us closer or tear us apart. The days that followed felt strange and hollow, as if we were living in the same house but in completely different worlds. I couldn't look at her without replaying that moment in my head, the way her head had rested on my shoulder, the feeling of her hand in mine. There was an ache I couldn't shake, and it weighed heavily on both of us, though we never spoke of it. Each time I thought about bringing it up, the words disappeared, leaving me trapped in my own silence. One evening, just as I was settling down to study, she appeared in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a tightness around her eyes that gave away the tension she was carrying. She lingered there for a moment before stepping into the room, as though she were crossing some invisible line between us. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice strained. I can't keep pretending that everything is normal." I closed my book, my heart pounding. I had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I found myself dreading it. "I know," I replied, barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to handle this either." She took a deep breath, walking over to sit beside me on the bed. The silence between us stretched, heavy and unresolved. She fidgeted with her hands, a nervous habit I hadn't seen in her before, and I realized just how affected she was by everything that had happened. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaky. "I think we need some boundaries," she said, each word carefully chosen. Things have gotten blurred lately, and I don't think that's safe for us." The word "safe" hit me like a sharp reminder of how far we'd gone off course. I nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. I wanted to ask her why it had come to this, why we had let things get to this point, but the words felt too raw, too exposing. "Maybe we just need to take a step back," she continued, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "To remember who we are to each other." My heart sank at her words. I knew she was right, but the thought of pulling back, of returning to the distance that had once existed between us, felt like a loss I wasn't ready to face. She reached out, placing her hand on mine. The touch was familiar, comforting, but there was a fragility to it now that felt like goodbye. "I'm still your mother," she whispered, as if reminding herself as much as me. "And I love you, as my son. We have to remember that." I looked at her, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest like stones. "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. "I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to make these feelings go away." Her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something that looked almost like regret. "It's not easy," she admitted, her voice raw and honest. "I don't know how we got here, but I know that whatever this is, it can't continue. We have to find a way back." For a long moment, we just sat there in silence, the air between us thick with everything we couldn't say. There was a deep, aching longing that neither of us knew how to voice, and it hung over us like a heavy cloud. Then, almost impulsively, she leaned in and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to my forehead. It was a mother's kiss, filled with tenderness and unspoken love, but there was a weight to it, an unspoken finality that felt like closure. "I just want you to know," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion, "that you mean everything to me. I never wanted things to get so complicated." I swallowed hard, feeling the tightness in my throat. "I know," I replied, barely managing to keep my voice steady. "You mean everything to me too." We sat in silence, lost in our own thoughts, the weight of her words pressing down on us. But there was also a sense of understanding, a silent agreement that this was where we had to draw the line, where we had to try to rebuild what had been lost. As she stood to leave, she gave me a sad, lingering smile. "Good night," she whispered, turning toward the door. But just as she reached the threshold, she paused, her back still to me. "Sometimes I wonder," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "if things could have been different. If maybe, in another life, we could have been something else." Her words stopped my heart for a moment. She didn't turn to look at me, and I didn't move. I was afraid that if I said anything, everything would unravel. Without another word, she left, her footsteps fading down the hall, leaving me alone in the quiet. I sat there, her words echoing in my mind, filling me with a hollow ache. Could things have been different? Could we have been something else? I didn't know, and the question lingered, haunting me as the silence of the empty room closed in around me. In the days that followed, we kept our distance. The tension between us lessened, but it was still there, hovering like a ghost we both avoided. We talked more, though, about simple things, everyday things, but the deeper conversations, the ones that mattered, remained untouched. There was no going back to the way things had been, and we both knew it. But at least there was a sense of peace in the air, as if we had finally accepted where we stood. One evening, I found myself sitting on the porch, staring out at the fading light of day. The sky was streaked with pinks and oranges, the kind of sunset that makes everything feel still for a moment. I heard her footsteps behind me and turned to see her standing in the doorway, watching me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice soft but careful. I nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. She sat down, and for a long while, we didn't say anything. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was just there, like an old companion we had grown used to. "It's been a strange few weeks," she said eventually, her tone thoughtful, as though she was choosing her words carefully. "Yeah," I agreed, my voice barely above a murmur. "It has." She sighed, leaning back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said, about how things could have been different." My chest tightened at the mention of those words, but I stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. "I don't think it's something we should dwell on," she added quickly, as if trying to lessen the weight of her words. "But I also don't want us to keep avoiding each other. We're family, and I don't want to lose that." I glanced at her, seeing the sincerity in her expression. "I don't want to lose that either," I replied softly. "But I don't know how to make things go back to normal." "I don't think they can," she admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "But maybe we can find a new normal. Something healthier, with boundaries." I nodded, understanding what she meant, even though the idea of boundaries between us still felt strange and uncomfortable. But I knew it was necessary. We couldn't stay in this limbo, pretending that the lines between us hadn't blurred. "I'd like that," I said finally, the words feeling both difficult and relieving at the same time. "I don't want things to be awkward forever." She smiled faintly, though there was still a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Me neither. I think we both need some space to figure things out, but I want you to know that I love you, and that's never going to change." Her words, though simple, carried a heavy significance, sinking deep into me. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "I love you too." The conversation felt like a tentative step forward, a fragile attempt to mend what had been broken. As the evening stretched on and the stars began to peek through the darkening sky, we sat in silence again, but this time, the quiet between us felt peaceful. The next few weeks became easier. We were still cautious around each other, still navigating the delicate balance between closeness and distance, but the tension had lessened. We talked more, the discomfort slowly fading, replaced by a mutual understanding of where we stood. One morning, she knocked on my door, her smile brighter than it had been in a long time. "I was thinking," she began, "how about we go on another trip? Just something short, like before. To clear our heads." I hesitated, remembering the weight of our last trip together, but I could see the hope in her eyes. She wanted to try again, to rebuild something from the pieces of what had happened. And a part of me wanted that too. "Yeah," I said, a small smile pulling at my lips. "That sounds good." This time, the drive felt lighter, filled with easy conversation and laughter that had been missing for a long time. We didn't talk about the past or about everything that had weighed us down. Instead, we focused on the present, enjoying each other's company without the shadow of unspoken emotions hanging over us. As we drove along the familiar winding roads, the trees blurring past, I realized something. Things between us weren't perfect, and maybe they never would be. But that was okay. We had found a way forward, a way to hold on to what mattered while letting go of what didn't. And for now, that was enough.